the topic of public memory of atrocity in particular, and at the same time expanding the reach and potential of the discussion by inviting outstanding scholars, such as Mark Goodale, from the affected countries and key international scholars in these areas of study to participate. So this is the first outside speaker of, we're having it throughout the course of the 2013-2014 academic year. And but along with the outside speakers, you're invited to come to the regular workshop, which meets at the same time every couple weeks in the same room. And 2 weeks from today, Wahutu Siguri is going to be presenting on his research on representations of the genocide in Darfur. And then our second outside speaker will be on November 25th. That's the week of Thanksgiving, I think, but we'll all still be here looking for excuses to stay warm. And it will be Anthony Robin, who's a professor of anthropology at Utrecht University, and he's going to be speaking on an Argentine genocide, individual accountability and collective guilt during the 76 to 83 dictatorship. And that will be at noon instead of our usual 3:30 slot.
It's actually 3 to 4:30. Our workshop is usually, I don't know why this is 3:30, but usually it's 3 to 4.
Okay. Well,
4:30.
go to our websites. You'll figure out the times. Get on our mailing lists. So anyway, we're happy to see you all here, and we're really delighted that our first outside speaker is with us today, Professor Mark Goodale. I was telling Professor Goodale that I use his book, Surrendering to Utopia, in my human rights advocacy class each year, because it brings together this, the tension, the interdisciplinary tension between anthropology and law, and human rights law in particular, but also looks at the issue of cultural relativism, which is a constant topic in the study of human rights in a really creative way. What I really like about Mark's research is he approaches it with an attitude of creative possibility. There are a lot of anthropologists and some social scientists, in my experience, since I come from the advocacy side of human rights, who settle for the low-hanging fruit in intellectual terms. They basically do a full-throated critique of the universalist assumptions in international human rights, and they stop there. But what I really appreciate about Mark's thoughtful approach is that he helps us to understand those critiques, but then he takes the next step and really thrives to use his imagination to bring us to a place where we can engage with human rights in all its complexity. And the other thing I really have appreciated about his work is that it's based in localities, and he has a specific local expertise in Latin America, especially Bolivia, which he'll be drawing on today. And that is something that I find is all too often missed in social legal scholarship. So I just want to thank you for bringing that approach, because it's an important conversation that we continue to have in human rights. So because of that, we thought he would be a really great first outside speaker for this series. So I'll give you some of the formal introduction. Mark Goodale has quite an impressive and productive career already, and I'm sure that there's lots more to come that we're going to appreciate. He's currently an associate professor of conflict analysis and anthropology at George Mason University, and he's the series editor of the Stanford Studies in Human Rights. That's what this book was part of. Before coming to George Mason, he was the first Marjorie Shostak Distinguished Lecturer in Anthropology at Emory University. He's the author and editor of 8 books, including most recently, Neoliberalism Interrupted, Social Change and Contested Governance in Contemporary Latin America, with Nancy Costero through the Stanford series. He's also written Human Rights and Anthropology. He's edited Human Rights and Anthropological Reader, Dilemmas of Modernity, The Practice of Human Rights with Sally Engle-Mary for Cambridge in 2007. He's talked to us at lunch today about his exciting new research, which he's going to talk about today, including really thinking about methodologies of using transmedia in terms of both of gathering information, but including the voices of communities in which he's doing ethnographic research in the very product itself. So it's a real pleasure to have Mark Goodale with us here today. So please join me in welcoming.
Thank you very much for that very generous introduction. It's very nice to be here at the University of Minnesota. As I was mentioning at lunch, I used to live in the Twin Cities way back in the day. I was going to say recently, but it's been a long time. I actually taught at St. Olaf College in Northfield, and spent every day of my working life driving on I think it's 35 south in all manner of weather conditions. So I really admire the hardy folk up in the upper Midwest, and I very much miss it. Let me just say thanks to a few people, and then I'll say a few things about what I'm going to talk about, and then I'll get started. Of course, I want to first thank Alejandro Bayer, Barb Fry, Catherine Sidking, and Chris Roberts and other members of the university community for inviting me here. I guess as Barbara was mentioning, I'm just learning there are a cross-cutting set of institutions and programs that are part of this really interesting and exciting work that goes on in Minnesota. So I think I say, let 1,000 flowers bloom. It's a really exciting work that Alejandro and Barb and others are spearheading here. Chris Roberts, I want to say just something about him, which is that I met Chris, I was going to say many years ago, but quite a few years ago when he was a graduate student in sociology at the University of Michigan. And I met Chris at a workshop organized by the Law and Society Association in Amherst in the summer. Very nice workshop. And Chris was a graduate student working on a dissertation. He was filled with ideas, and I got to know him there. And so it's just really wonderful to reacquaint myself with Chris years later now as a colleague, and to see his career flourishing. So I just wanted to recognize that. As Barb was mentioning, we did have lunch, and in fact, I'm not going to talk about the transmedia dimension of it, but that's something which is certainly coming. And I will say that as the first speaker in this series, I'm a little bit of an odd duck in the sense that what I'm going to talk about today in my research is not centrally related to genocide or atrocity and the relationship between how human rights helps manage and deal with mass atrocity. My regional area has been Bolivia, and Bolivia has not, unlike, say, Peru or Argentina or Chile and other countries in Latin America, has not been the site of the kind of civil war or atrocity. And so what that's meant is that it's forced me to think about human rights sort of outside the shining light of the spotlight of some of these more extraordinary type of topics, and to consider issues of human rights sort of outside of, on the margins in some way of some of these debates. And that's actually been very helpful for me, because it's allowed me to see the way in which human rights works in these other areas. And principally what I'm going to talk about today is the role of human rights and the role of law more generally in processes of social change, and in this case, radical social change, revolution. And so so maybe you'll start more with a marginal talk, and I know when Tony Robbin comes, you'll then be firmly at the center of perhaps some of the debates you've been having. So I've got a paper that I'm going to read for you. I'm going to read today. This is an extract of a longer work in process on the role of human rights and law in the constitutional revolution in Bolivia, and hopefully we'll have time to talk about some of the ideas that I'm working through, and it's really great because I'm at that place in this project where I need to air the ideas in public and get critical feedback, so I really do look forward to the conversation. Okay, so let me just begin. In February 2009, after several years of violence, national and regional political debate, collective agonizing by center-left intellectuals in Bolivia and beyond, and the emergence of Bolivia itself as a kind of icon of legal and political experimentation in Latin America, it falls ambiguously somewhere between Allende's Chile and Chavez's Venezuela. The Bolivian people approved a new constitution in a national referendum that was merely the culmination in a series of popular referenda that have served as socio-political signposts since the unprecedented first election of Evo Morales in late 2005. But if these moments of national political strife and performance are signposts, what are they pointing toward? Now, social scientists and others have grappled with this question with a pervading sense of humility tempered by uncertainty. In my own earlier book, Dilemmas of Modernity, I argue that the first glimpses of the conceptual architecture of Bolivia's constitutional struggle revealed a vernacularized form of revolutionary liberalism, one that brought together currents from several distinct legacies of social and political mobilization within a normative framework derived from the rhetorics of human and indigenous rights that took root across much of Latin America in the mid-1990s. And yet the constitutional revolution of Evo Morales and the governing Movimiento al Socialismo, or MAS party, remains elusive for scholars as much as the protagonists and antagonists themselves in what has become a morality play about the potential for and limitations to law and human rights as a mechanism for radical social change in the contemporary world. Now, since 2005, my research has been part of a wider collaborative movement to reassess the conflict in Bolivia and rethink several assumptions that have grounded the critical study of Latin America more generally that emerged in the aftermath of the restoration of civilian governments in the mid-1980s and the institutionalization of neoliberalism in the post-Cold War period. And this talk, as I mentioned, synthesizes key empirical and analytical findings from a wider project on the shifting landscapes of social, legal, and political change. Okay, so what I'm going to do is dwell at some length on this revolutionary process, which they call in Bolivia refundación, or refoundation, as a way to provide some beginning ethnographic and historical context. And then I will examine several discrete but interconnected problems that are central to our understanding of the relationship between law and social change in Bolivia since 2005, and the relationship between law and social change more generally. So for example, there's the question of the constitutional revolution itself. Just as in the late 18th century in France and North America, and throughout the first part of the 19th century in the Americas, including what is today Bolivia, revolution continues to suggest a point at the far end of a spectrum of socio-political change. Nothing more transformative or radical does or can lie beyond. And as anthropologists and other social scientists have observed, however, the practice of revolution, as it were, reveals its own cross-cultural contradictions, failures, incompletenesses, hypocrisies, as well as moments of inspiration. But as a discursive category, as a logic of social and political action, it is important to make the point that revolution, in my terms, implies what can be thought of as a form of secular world reversal, a forced 180-degree turn through the arc of existing relations of power. And yet the concept, if not the practice, of constitutional revolution, particularly in the post-Cold War, implies something quite different, since the writing, ratification, and implementation of the Constitution do not mark the end of the turn, the reversal. They constitute the revolution itself. In other words, the process of revolution in contemporary Bolivia is expressed in terms of the bureaucracies and instrumentalities of law translated into political and social categories. But is law adequate to the task of revolution? It is one thing to make law the foundation for recovery or the basic framework for stemming the desire for vengeance. It is quite another to make law the methodology of radical political and social transformation itself. Now, Bolivia's experiment in revolutionary hybridity follows very self-consciously on the heels of the South African experiment of the mid-1990s, and this section later in my talk will consider the question of constitutional revolution comparatively. And I'll I'll finish by taking up the question of violence and its relation to law. Now, post-2005, Bolivia has been rocked by different forms of violence, from the humiliations and beatings of peasant activists in the Plaza 25 de Mayo in Sucre in May 2008, to the massacre of rural union leaders in the Amazonian town of Porvenir in September 2008, from the alleged attempt to assassinate President Morales in Santa Cruz in April of 2009, and to the months of daily unrest outside the walls of the Constitutional Convention in Sucre, during which 3 anti-mas cívicos, as they call themselves, were killed by the local anti-riot police. But rather than focus on these much more publicly dramatic moments of disruption and breach, the concern here, and last part of my paper, will be on a more subtle context of violence, what I'm calling the quote-unquote violence of ambiguity. Now, in this final section, I will argue that the constitutional revolution in Bolivia is a reflection, among other things, of one of the most significant deficits of the early 21st century, which is the absence of a major global counter-movement to the logics of late capitalist accumulation and neoliberal political consolidation. Indeed, as others have rightly observed, the material conditions of life for many, including in Bolivia, have gotten substantially worse during the last 15 years, as the end of the Cold War removed the most obvious discursive counter-argument to capitalist hegemony. And in many ways, the dialectical struggles of the Cold War were characterized by the potential for less violence, because the well-defined models for globalization on the one hand, and resistance on the other, constrained as much as they enabled both action and argument. Clarity, in this sense, which was a function of a kind of transnational legitimacy, meant that the parameters of conflict, the boundaries within which struggle must take place, were visible to all. But what happens when those parameters vanish? Okay, so let me focus, turn to Reframing. And I'm going to start with some quotes from my research from some key members of the revolution. So the first is a quote from a passage by someone called Carlos Dabdou, who is the leading intellectual of the anti-government movement in Santa Cruz. And he told me in an interview, he said, "We are not conservatives. We want revolution as well, because the fight for autonomy today is becoming a revolutionary process, and that is our main aim and interest." And the other thing that I would like to differentiate about our true revolution and the false revolution of the government is our method of struggle. For us, the method is democratic. It is through the vote. It is through respect for the rule of law. The government, by contrast, wants to make a revolution without respect for the rule of law and through confrontation. Here's a perspective from someone called Sacha Llorente, who described himself to me as the Karl Rove of Bolivia. He was Morales' right-hand man until he was deposed after as a kind of scapegoat after the Tignis conflict over the road. He was sort of a scapegoat, although he didn't have anything to do with it. But he told me, he said, "As a revolutionary government, we are simply a government of social movements, especially those that are fighting against neoliberalism. Without the revolution, within the revolution, there are various spaces for vigorous debate in which the discussion is horizontal and critical. Many of us never had the intention of holding public office, yet because it is a revolutionary process, one must assume one's proper role and start building bridges, and then burn all the boats after the bridges are built, because it's a one-way road, for better or worse, a journey without return." And here's a quote from the local MAS leader, a kind of low-level functionary. He says, "Why do we want to refound our nation? We want to recover our identities and our self-respect. When we speak of revolution as Aymaras," this is an indigenous people in Bolivia, "we speak of a democratic and cultural revolution because Aymaras have always been lovers of life. For us, the rivers, the trees, our plants and high mountains, they're treated like they also have life because they give us food and sustain us. But this is not an armed struggle. It is a different kind of struggle. As I said, a cultural and democratic revolution in which we don't have to kill anyone, because ours is a culture of life and not death." And here is finally, just in these initial quotes, the leader of the La Paz Teachers Union. Bolivia has a very strong union, tradition of union movement. And he says, "Evo Morales tells us that we are in the midst of a process of peaceful change. that we can't speak of structural revolution, but only cultural revolution that will lead to a refounded Bolivia. But we in the teachers union, we don't call this a revolution because it doesn't touch at the root of the capitalist system, which is private property. How do you know if a revolution is real or not? Based on its position in relation to private property. If it respects private property, it's bourgeois. Now, we might want to change things, make things more humane, fix some things, but if it still respects private property, it can only implement a form of bourgeois change. And for us, the only real revolution is one that seeks to eliminate private property and replace it with social property. Four very distinct views of revolution. Now, the Bolivia of 2013, as you can see, is a nation marked by a pervasive frame of what I describe as discursive intensification. The rhetoric of revolution is in the air. It's on walls and newspapers and government documents and speeches, but most importantly for my purposes, in everyday conversation among people across multiple and dynamic political spectrums, for whom revolution has simply become in some ways coextensive with the present. But as these voices that I just said of four quite different kinds of actors in Bolivia's contemporary drama illustrate, the meaning and implications of revolution are contested. Nevertheless, the multiplicity of both revolution as concept and revolution as practice simply underscores the deeper point that at least since 2005, the country, Bolivia, has been thrust into a period, an epoch, a historical moment, in which all of the problems and points of contradiction, which go back centuries, for example, around land, ethnic discrimination, the distribution of political power, inter-regional strife, and the country's dependence on global capital markets, are now bracketed by a meta-narrative in which the grounding of the nation, the social contract itself, has been put into play. And as you'll see, that has real consequences. Now, in his excellent recent study of the continuing impact of Bolivia's Trotskyist legacy, the historian S. Sandor John argues that a culture of radical politics first took shape in Bolivia in the 1930s and paved the way in 1952 for what is known as the National Revolution. And John quotes from Guillermo Lora, an early leader of the still active Partido Obrero Revolucionario, or Revolutionary Workers' Party, or POR, who liked to boast that Bolivia es un país trotskizado. Bolivia is a Trotskyized country. Now, although POR appealed most directly and famously to Bolivia's miners, it also was, and to a certain extent still is, the political movement for certain segments of Bolivia's massive labor unions, such as the teachers, municipal workers, and medical professionals. And there is no question, as John also argues, that Bolivia's Trotskyist movement is an important source and even organizing principle of what he calls Bolivia's quote-unquote radical tradition. Now, this is actually a common trope in the historiography of Bolivia. Most famously, the historian James Dunkerley argued that Bolivians have quote-unquote rebellion in the veins. Now, the meaning here was doubly metaphorical. At one level, rebelliousness and revolution have marked the Bolivian experience in such a way that they course through the body politic and, in a sense, give it life. And at a different level, Bolivia's rebelliousness is strongly associated with the nation's miners, who have often fought pitched battles in and around the entrance to their socavones, those quote-unquote hell-hot mine shafts that turn their lungs to dust. But after 2005, this radical tradition was reinscribed within what I argue is a qualitatively different context, one in which revolution is not counterposed with counter-revolution. The left does not exist in a neat and tidy dialectical relationship with the right. Instead, everyone has become, in a sense, an actual or potential revolutionary. And after the ratification of the new Constitution in 2009, revolutionary has become a new category of citizenship, even if the ends and content of revolution are, as we have seen, multiple and in dispute. Now, when I asked him if the so-called right in Santa Cruz has assumed its historical role as counter-revolutionaries, even Carlos Dapu, who I mentioned, the leading intellectual of the opposition movement, wrapped himself in the mantle of a revolutionary as citizen. And this is him talking again. He said, "We are also revolutionaries. In fact, there are two revolutions in Bolivia now, ours and the government's. The government's is a revolution that seeks to concentrate power. Ours is a revolution that seeks to share power. And when you share power, you deepen, profundiza, the foundation of democracy." And perhaps most revealingly of all, even Dr. Juan Carlos Santos Esteban, the shadowy spiritual leader of Bolivia's Falange movement, which has direct ties to neo-fascists and skinheads in Spain, as I've documented in correspondence, is quick to reframe his movement's ideology in terms of a revolutionary struggle. And this is him talking about this. This is hard to get to him, but anyway. He says, and a medical doctor, which is interesting, like Mimosa as well. He says, our revolution is a struggle only for the well-being of man. Oh, thank you. Our revolution is a struggle only for the well-being of man. This is the only thing we believe in. Our struggle is for man and the well-being of the family, because fundamentally the family is the nucleus of every society. So this discursive shift and intensification in post-2005 and 2009 Bolivia takes place against the background of what is commonly known as Reframing, which is the device that Evo Morales frequently uses to characterize the constitutional human rights revolution, a manner of framing the process of political and social change that gestures toward the essentially technocratic architecture of a revolution that is being articulated through the new constitution and the follow-on laws that are meant to elaborate or reglamentar its provisions. Okay? Now, this was not an accident of history, but part of an intentional strategy on the part of MAS leaders to make the rule of law the framework that would both constitute revolution and at the same time define its outer limits. During the campaign in 2003 and 2004, leading up to his first election in 2005, Morales was clear that the first step in a MAS government would be the establishment of a constitutional convention that would produce an entirely new, not reformed, constitution or social contract, as they say. In fact, after he was elected with the largest majority of Bolivia since the restoration of civilian governance in the mid-1980s, Morales and a group of MAS advisors and progressive lawyers made a beeline for South Africa, the first foreign trip, where they consulted with government officials, ANC activists, and human rights and constitutional lawyers over several days of closed meetings. Now, as MAS officials have explained to me, the purpose of Morales' first trip as head of state was to learn the lessons from South Africa's own constitutional revolution of 1994-95, which produced what was at the time arguably the most radical post-Westphalian constitution in the world. Now, the main lesson the Bolivian delegation took from its pilgrimage, that's how they described it, as a pilgrimage, to South Africa, was that its constitution did not go far enough. Like many constitutions before it, it was the product of too many compromises, too much caution in the face of demands from the Aung regime. As Heinz Klug has argued, in his definitive study of what he calls South Africa's quote-unquote legal revolution, the new constitution of South Africa was riven by compromises or agreements to disagree throughout many of its most important articles. And this meant, and this is Klug talking, postponing decisions on sensitive and potentially unresolvable questions. Unquote. Now, the problem, of course, is that many of these sensitive so-called questions were in fact lingering and deep social, economic, and political contradictions that were inseparable from the different iterations of South Africa since the 17th century. So although the enfranchisement of South Africa's non-white majorities and the elimination of the antediluvian system of apartheid represented real and measurable advances, what the 18 years after 1995 have demonstrated more than anything else is that a revolution that is too tightly circumscribed within the logics of quote-unquote democratization is one that is destined to remain incomplete, a kind of ongoing false promise. Now, the leaders of MAS had the case in South Africa firmly in mind as they established the Asamblea Constituyente, or Constitutional Assembly, in the historic capital of Sucre in August of 2006, within the first year of Evo Morales' inauguration. Although the original 255 assambleístas represented a broad swath of contemporary Bolivian society, politics, and ethnic diversity, it soon became apparent to the members from the separatist eastern and southern lowlands, who were known at this time as the Media Luna, or Half Moon, that negotiation over the terms of the new social contract would only be possible within the inner circles of the MAS assembly members and their advocates in the government. Through the end of 2006 and into the first part of 2007, the discontent among the Media Luna representatives in the Asamblea intersected with another distinct thread of opposition to the government of Evo Morales and the Constitutional Convention. And this was the local movement to make Sucre itself a kind of latter-day city-state that would recover its early position of prestige as the site of the Primer Grito de Libertad, or the place of the first act of defiance against the Spanish colonial empire in the New World. Now this movement, the separate movement known as Capitalidad Plena, or simply Capitalidad, which was only on its surface a struggle to make Sucre the unitary or only capital of Bolivia, came together with the separatist ambitions of the Media Luna in a combustible mix, a kind of perfect storm of oppositional energy that ultimately exploded in violence outside the walls of the Constitutional Assembly itself. And I should pause here just to say that Bolivia, like South Africa, interestingly, has divides its government between La Paz, the so-called seat of the government, and Sucre, which they call a constitutional seat of head of center of government, where the constitutional court is. Okay. Now this energy culminated in a mass demonstration by townspeople against the assembly and the members from MAS in November 2007, during which 3 people, including 2 local university students, were killed by police in the rioting that took place outside the historic district of Central Sucre. Now, after the violence of late November, the constitutional process threatened to stall as the Media Luna and their local Capitalidad allies denounced the assembly and eventually walked out, leaving a much reduced 165-member delegation that was heavily stacked with MAS members and their supporters. The assembly itself, physically, was moved by the national government first to a military school on the outskirts of Sucre as a protective measure, and then when that didn't work, all the way over to the departmental capital of Oruro, in a solidly pro-MAS region of the Altiplano. Now, without any significant opposition presence in the assembly, the process shifted dynamics yet again and then moved rapidly into yet another phase that encompasses the present. So in December 2007, the draft constitution was sent to the National Congress for a set of arcane legal procedures of approval and textual modification. In October 2008, the National Congress approved the new constitution and then also authorized a national referendum or vote to put the Constitution before the people. In August 2008, a referendum revocatorio, or a vote of no confidence, was held in which Evo Morales was ratified with more than 67% of the vote nationwide. And in January 2009, the referendum on the Constitution itself was held and it was approved by 61%. In December 2009, Evo Morales was then re-elected with 64% of the vote. And finally, the new Constitution came into force in February of 2009. Now, during a charged ceremony to mark this historic moment, the entry of the new Constitution, Morales gave a fiery and somewhat Castro-like speech in which he said, quote, "Now I want to tell you, they can drag me from the palace, the government palace. They can kill me, but mission accomplished for the refounding of the new united Bolivia," unquote. Now, this rhetoric by Morales, who has appeared in terms both increasingly weary and defiant in recent years, merely echoed the complex, poetic, and analytically bedeviling preamble to the Constitution itself, which asserts triumphantly, from the preamble to the Constitution, complying with the mandate of our peoples, with the strength of our Pachamama, our Mother Earth, and thanks to God, we refundamos Bolivia, we refound Bolivia. But what does it mean to refound a nation through a constitutional revolution saturated with human rights? Okay, so I'll switch over to more, that's the background, and switch over to more conceptual discussion. Now, in one of the more revealing research moments I've had over the last 5 years, I asked the senior MAS senator and former vice presidential candidate, Antonio Paredo, to explain what I've described as the normative promiscuity of the new Constitution. 411 articles that contain a version of every international and transnational, human, indigenous, and collective right, and many duties, that either does or does not exist, as far as we know. A new model of the state that radically horizontalizes the relationship between branches of government. At the same time, it creates 3 parallel and juridically independent expressions of the nation, what they call the ordinary, the agro-environmental, and this is the direct translation, the first people indigenous peasant. It's as awkward in Spanish as it is in English. And a new model of political economy that combines nearly every existing economic principle and mode of production, including communism, market capitalism, extractivism, state socialism, small-scale social cooperativism, unionism or syndicalismo, and sustainable development. Now, after explaining to Pareto my own sense of the scope and implications of the Constitution, and just giving him my description of how incredible this was, how expansive this was, I asked him how this happened. And he looked at me with and he's usually very talkative. He talks for hours and hours, which is great for a researcher. You just hit the button on the tape recorder and you have hundreds of pages of transcript. But after explaining this, he kind of looked at me and he was sort of at a loss for words. And he said, because he was part of the drafting of the Constitution, he said, we just couldn't say no. Now, what he meant, we just couldn't say no, and what this says about the possibilities for and impossibilities of radical social change in the contemporary world, 21st century status of power in post-colonial countries, and the absence of a well-defined non-liberal models of state formation, among others, is, as I suggested, the basis for the longer work that I'm synthesizing here. But for my purposes, what's most important about Pareto's sort of laser-like acknowledgement is what it tells us about the character of law as both the locus and the means of revolution. So there was no doubt among the mas assambleístas, those were in the assembly, especially after the opposition had abandoned the constitutional process from the inside, that the new Magna Carta, as it's often referred to by the Bolivian press, usually with more than a touch of irony, would circumscribe as much as it would enable the process of refundación. That is, the Constitution would both bracket institutionally and comprise the revolution itself. To this extent, it was important among the MAS delegates, many of whom were acting as clear proxies of the president, vice president, and leading intellectuals and advisors in the government, to ensure that the new social contract was as normatively centrifugal as possible. Okay? So ideas, concepts, nascent models of governance that had any support at all, and which did not crudely represent a vestige of what we might think of as the four horsemen of the apocalypse: colonialism, imperialism, racism, and neoliberalism, were given the initial legal grounding from which they could spin, right? Some perhaps innovatively and perhaps wildly out of control. And yet a legal grounding, even one that is intended to expand and then frame the possibilities for radical social and political change, is not just an alternative mechanism of revolution. It is not simply the framing of transformation in other terms. Rather, what we might call the legalization of revolution produces what Gunzel and Schmidt-Neurer, in his afterword to Horkheimer and Adorno's dialectic of enlightenment, calls a quote-unquote change of function. That is a shift in both the meaning of and possibilities for revolution because of its quote-unquote failure to be realized in existing society. Except in the case of the Bolivian Constitution, the change of function does not come as a response to the failure of revolution, but as a way to prevent the failure. In other words, the absence of a viable non-liberal and thus non-constitutional model for radical political and social transformation means that constitutionalism in the Bolivian vernacular represents a kind of Hobson's choice. Constitutional revolution, with all of its contradictions and structural limitations, or nothing. But even if constitutionalism was the only viable option available to MAS political activists and intellectuals as they envisioned a post-neoliberal Bolivia, is law itself adequate to the task? What are the implications for the Bolivian revolution of what the Chilean legal scholar Javier Couso has recently described as the quote-unquote judicialization of politics in Latin America? First, there is a problem of a fundamental tension between the form and the intent of law, a kind of normative irony in which the centralizing and exclusionary forms of law work against the intention to use the new constitution to pull the existing nation state apart at its economic, political, and cultural seams. Now, the Constitution attempts to lessen the starkness of this tension by displacing both the site and legitimacy of justice from the institutions of law to the people. Okay, so it's not so stark. As Article 178 says of the Constitution, the power to impart justice emanates from the Bolivian people. And this power of the people is characterized by, ready, independence, impartiality, transparency, probity, swiftness, legal pluralism, interculturalism, equity, service to society, citizen participation, social harmony, and respect for basic human rights. We just couldn't say no. The Constitution also develops an alternative to the dominant liberal legal principle of secular jurisdictional autonomy, in which the law of the nation-state is sovereign within a differentiated hierarchy of regional and subject matter competencies. Articles 179 to 192 establish three entirely separate legal systems. The first is the so-called ordinary court system, with its own hierarchy of courts, culminating in a court of last resort called the Supreme Judicial Tribunal. The second is what they call the agro-environmental legal system, also with its own courts, headed by the Agro-Environmental Tribunal, a court of last resort. And finally, there is the indigenous peasant legal system, comprised not of courts in the strict sense, but what they call mechanisms of indigenous justice, found throughout the country. Now, critically, Articles 190 to 192 say nothing about processes of appeal from decisions within local justice forms. And there is also, interestingly, no court of last resort within the indigenous peasant legal system. Article 179 says that the ordinary and indigenous peasant jurisdictions are equal, and one does not have supremacy over the other. And the status of the agro-environmental legal system in relation to the other two is not specified in the Constitution. And yet all of this innovation takes place, not simply within the boundaries of the Constitution, but even more importantly for my argument, in terms of a massive body of what is known as the derecho reglamentado, the hundreds of follow-on laws and administrative orders that must be promulgated in order to actualize the articles of the Constitution within the ever-present chaos of Bolivian society and politics. And to a large extent, this massive body of law remains today, and will remain for some time, in many years to come, a figment of Mas's revolutionary imagination. Not because of a unified opposition to the Constitution, but because the machinery that must produce derecho reglamentado grinds forward with the kind of bureaucratic inertia that characterizes the production of follow-on law all around the world, within forms of governance of a wide range. So a constitutional revolution in this sense does not suffer from a gap between an idealist theory of radical social change on the one hand, and the mundane and compromising realities of implementation. Rather, the problem is that the mundane realities of implementation are actually derived from the conceptual framework through which the theory of radical social change is expressed, that is, constitutionalism. A second implication of the legalization of revolution is that the logic of law, including constitutional law, depends on a technocratic rationality, as many have argued, through which social, political, and ideological problems are broken down into their smallest coherent parts and then addressed as if they were microcosms of a larger problem. For example, as scholars of the International Criminal Court have shown, the legalization of international justice through the Rome Statute has led to what Kamari Clark has described as fictions of justice. That is, a gap between the complicated aspirations of diverse actors within local contexts and histories, and the tendency of international law to reduce moments of atrocity and victimization to their juridical essence. Now, even though we might say that this gap can provide a basis for giving texture and meaning to international justice beyond law, we must acknowledge at the same time how the technocratic reductionism of law can make it an awkward mechanism for transforming the diffuse underlying contradictions that give rise to demands for radical social and political change in the first place. And finally, the legalization of revolution has implications for what we might call the phenomenology of social change, the elusive and ambiguous experiential dimensions of people's lives in the midst of social transformation. For Alejandro, a social work student at the National University of La Paz and a leader of his faculty student union, the new constitution is the means through which the state would become, in his words, this is a quote, more open, more accessible, more connected to the people, unquote. He also sees the Constitution as a symbol of a new orientation to the relationship between nature and society. As he puts it, quote, the Constitution takes inspiration from the way of life in the countryside, where the huipala, which is the indigenous flag of Bolivia, is a symbol for how to live in nature as part of nature and a return to nature, unquote. For Patricia Choque, the General Secretary of Bolivia's Confederation of Women's Peasants, perhaps the most powerful woman within the indigenous movement, the new constitution is most radical, according to her, in the way it recognizes and gives force to what she calls community justice, which she believes is the essence, the deepest expression of indigenous culture. And for a high-ranking official within the National Human Rights Office, which is in Bolivia is called the Defensoría del Pueblo, the simple existence of the new constitution is a way to silence critics of the revolutionary process, especially those in the media who, quote, allow themselves to become the puppets of those in the more conservative sectors of society who want to destabilize the government and avoid as long as possible this process of change, unquote. Now, what these and many other reports from the ethnography and research of revolution in Bolivia tell us is that the government's strategy since the early 2000s to make the new constitution and not some other mechanism, the key locus of change, has had a profound impact on the ways in which people think and talk about conflict and the possibility for social transformation. But here's the question: when the Constitution is the embodiment of revolution, what lies behind it? Right? So the Constitution brackets revolution. What lies outside of that? In other words, what does it mean when the chronically deferred hopes of historically marginalized populations, as diverse as they are, become encapsulated within the four corners of legal instruments? As I have already argued, a revolutionary constitution is like a promise. But what is the likelihood, even the inevitability, that this promise is destined to be seen as false? Now, returning back to South Africa, here's how Heinz Klug characterized the problem that confronted the South African constitutional revolutionaries in the mid-1990s. And some of you might know Heinz Klug, law professor at the University of Wisconsin, who himself was part of the draft of the revolutionary process of the 1990s and played a role in drafting the new constitution. He says here in his book, the struggle against apartheid was premised on the promise of a future South Africa in which all people would enjoy rights and opportunities. Despite these high aspirations, the builders of a new South Africa faced a formidable legacy of inequality, social dislocation, and destitution. This was the context in which the ANC thought about the responsibility of governance and framed its constitutional options, unquote. But as Klug himself and other scholars of post-apartheid South Africa have demonstrated, there has been an enduring gap between rights and opportunities in South Africa, both because the, quote, formidable legacy of inequality, dislocation, and destitution continues, albeit in different forms and in relation to a different set of actors, and because the framework of even a profound expansion of constitutional rights and categories can only begin to adequately address the range of structural problems that this quote-unquote formidable legacy represents. That is to say, what Klug means by opportunities are not a necessary consequence of what he means by rights. And when the most pressing structural problem within the formidable legacy is the kind of inequality in landholding that one typically associates with feudal forms of land tenure, then the enfranchisement of a new majority and the reinscription of the citizen in terms of human rights can quickly appear as hollow victories indeed. Now, the legacies of inequality, social dislocation, and destitution in Bolivia have been no less formidable than South Africa's, even if its poor and marginalized have been formal participants in the nation's political life since the 1952 National Revolution, which ended the dreaded literacy requirement at the polls and established universal suffrage, at least in theory. In practice, however, Bolivia remained through the end of the 20th century, in the historian Herb Klein's words, a typical racist state in which the Indian non-Spanish-speaking peasantry was held in control by a small white Spanish-speaking elite, and in which political power was ultimately based on violence rather than consensus, unquote. Now, the new constitution proposes a radical break with this history from top to bottom, for example, by imposing a social usefulness test on all forms of private property, by shielding rural, social, political, and legal institutions from the control and oversight of the state, and by creating a 5,000-hectare limit on land ownership. But how will these constitutional mechanisms of refundación respond when the problems they are meant to address continue, even deepen in the coming years. It would seem that something more than a revolution in body, and thus circumscribed by a new constitution, is necessary. As the great American abolitionist Frederick Douglass said, quote, "Those who profess to favor freedom and yet depreciate agitation are men who want crops without plowing up the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want ocean without the awful roar of its many waters," unquote. And yet, doesn't this great truth, born of another formidable legacy of inequality, suggest the possibility, even the desirability, of a process of refoundation that takes place also while outside the boundaries of law, through the roar of struggle and resistance? So I take up this question in the next and final section. This is on violence and the ambiguity of law. So one of the most important insights from the social and cultural study of law over the last 20 years has been the idea that marginalized populations do not simply resist power by preserving forms of law outside the gaze of the state and those legally plural shadows that legal anthropologists in particular have described with such sensitivity and ethnographic richness. Rather, as Julia Eckhart, for example, has argued, in the post-Cold War, we have seen how the excluded and vulnerable increasingly emerge from these shadows, bearing law itself as a weapon, a classic Scottian weapon of the weak, to wield it with varying degrees of effectiveness against the state. Perhaps the best example of this use of quote-unquote law against the state has been human rights. As some of us and some of you have documented and theorized, the rhetorics of human rights offer an empowering moral discourse whose power is derived not always from its transitive instrumentality, but rather from the ways in which it can shake existing accounts of the person to their very core. Of course, as a rhetoric of empowered personhood, we might wonder at the extent to which this is a specific example of quote-unquote law against the state. Nevertheless, in even the most intensely symbolic example of what I have described elsewhere as the connotative power of human rights, the specter of law, national, international, transnational, is always there. Moreover, throughout much of the literature that James Scott, Weapons of the Weak, inspired, and the recent anthropology of human rights for that matter, the assumption has been that the state is the site of elite consolidation and entrenchment, that the vernacularization of especially international human rights law has been a way to mediate or even transform altogether the structural conditions that make the state hostile to the diffusion of political power. Perhaps the best example of this from the recent ethnography of law is Shannon Speed's account of the way Zapatista activists drew from human rights ideas to construct these local organic political institutions, the juntas de buen gobierno, or good governance councils, as a reaction to a history of state ambivalence toward Mexico's indigenous southern regions. But what happens, as in the case of Bolivia, when the state itself becomes a weapon of the weak? And more specifically, what happens to the subversive capacity of law when the connotative gets collapsed into the denotative? In other words, when the moral and aspirational expressions of human rights in particular are suddenly transformed into a large and highly differentiated body of specific constitutional and administrative rules and provisions. In Bolivia, it is no longer the case, as before, that the absence of human rights-based state law creates spaces for the creative deployment of transnational norms as a form of political and social practice, with an organic basis in ongoing, usually local disputes and struggles. And that's my first work on Bolivia. That's the period I was documenting, pre-2005, when the coming of transnational norms created these creative spaces in primarily rural areas where human rights norms were taken up and used in this way. But after 2009, in some ways the opposite is now true, or at least potentially so. As the normative exuberance of the revolutionary constitution becomes slowly but surely derecho reglamentado, the spaces in which law was formally deployed against the neoliberal state and its allies will become formally, and are becoming formally, institutionalized. They will become, in a sense, the primary mechanisms for social change. And when law as protest becomes derecho reglamentado, the nature of protest itself undergoes a critical shift, resistance to the state there then becomes resistance to social change. And it becomes then, by definition, reactionary, since the state is no longer the embodiment of elite consolidation and control. So we have returned, in other words, by a very circuitous path to the central concern of the British Marxist historian P. Thompson, who argued in the afterword to his masterful study of the English Black Act of 1723, that the logics of law can never be simply deployed at the service of the powerful, whether the powerful are a landed gentry determined to protect its bases of wealth in an emerging post-aristocratic society, or a newly enfranchised political class that is committed to the rule of law as a tool of revolution. As Thompson argued, the law constrains even when the institutions and actors of the law are mere proxies for the elite. Writing in 1975, he reminded us there are other ways in which the elite imposes its will without any regard for the law at all. And that we should never forget that this exercise of naked power, what this looks like, and what he called this very dangerous century. So revolutionary Bolivia is also a very dangerous place, and for quite different reasons and with quite different implications for law and the use of human rights. Ironically, the ambiguities of both power and the potential for violence were revealed to me most starkly by a most unlikely person, the Defensor del Pueblo in Santa Cruz, who is, structurally at least, the leading voice for human rights, the poor, and the rule of law in this important region of Bolivia. Now, the position of the so-called defender of the people was created during the 1990s, during the high point of neoliberalism, as a way to give local teeth to the flood of national legislation that followed from the rapid ratification of international human rights treaties. The office of the Defensoria has been maintained and even strengthened since 2005 and 2009. Now, after explaining to her that I believed it was necessary to understand the regular paroxysms of violence in post-2005 Bolivia, as I said, from the beating and humiliation of MAS activists to the torture and massacre of at least 20 rural political leaders in Porvenir in September 2008, which was described by UNASUR, a regional body, as genocide, which is what's happening in Bolivia. After explaining this violence, even during this revolution in Bolivia, her expression changed. And although we've been having what seemed like a predictable discussion, a dark shadow came over her face, and she blurted out, well, what do you think would happen? What do you think you would do if all this happened in your country? How would you like it if your government decided everything like authoritarians and like they were above the law? No one is guilty until they've been convicted through a court process. So I don't know if Leopoldo Fernandez, he was the leader of the department who was accused of genocide, is guilty or innocent. But I don't care if a government is at the left or the right, green, blue, white, yellow. When it utilizes the institutions of the state to create social change, it's an abuse pure and simple. So as the head of the main state institution charged with protecting human rights, this was a curious outburst from someone whose sympathies, as it turned out, couldn't be further from the process of Reframing. Now, of course, the response of the leader of Bolivia's Falange movement, back to San Esteban, to the question of violence was more predictable, if no less chilling, when I was talking about violence. And he said, quote, "We actually believe in sedition when the government attacks the liberty of the people. Sedition is a response by the losers in the struggle. When you lose, it's sedition. But when you win, they call it heroic. Rebellion is a form of disobedience to the attack on liberty. When the social order is bad, you have an obligation, a duty, a right to resist the attack on the family, on dignity, on the home, with violence if necessary." Unquote. Okay. So although the law in these times must be mobilized as a means of containing violent reaction against the process of social change, regardless of what we think of the revolution in Bolivia itself, the law can also constrain the kind of innovation and creativity that are demanded by the quote-unquote formidable legacies that make Bolivia a kind of paradigm of structural inequality. Now, the end of the dialectics of the Cold War created a space in which the human rights-infused rhetoric of social change laid the fertile ground in which Mas's ambiguous constitutional revolution could take root. But state law at the service of radical social change is still law from above, often institutionally remote, and trapped within the logics of delay, reglamentación, due consideration, and deference to the rigors of procedure.